The hum of distant starship engines echoed faintly through the maintenance bay as Elias Drake adjusted the final stabilizer on his battered cargo skiff. He wiped a streak of grease from his rugged jaw, his steel blue eyes scanning the desolate expanse of the asteroid field beyond the station's translucent bulkhead. Isolation suited him. After years of war and command, he'd earned the right to be forgotten, just a lone man with nothing but memories for company. A soft chime drew his attention. His console flashed with an alert. Unidentified vessel approaching. Elias frowned. Traffic through the sector was rare, and his station wasn't marked on any official charts. He tapped a few controls, switching the feed to an external camera. His breath hitched. A sleek, alien warship loomed in the darkness, shimmering like liquid silver under the pale light of distant stars. Its angular wings spread wide, casting an ominous shadow over his station. Before he could react, the comm system crackled to life with a voice that was both melodic and commanding. "Captain Elias Drake, surrender immediately. Resistance will be met with lethal force." The tone was cold, efficient, and unmistakably alien. Elias's heart pounded. He hadn't been called captain in years. His hand hovered over the emergency lock override, but before he could activate it, the station trembled violently. Impact detected. Hull breach imminent. Red lights bathed the room in an urgent glow. He grabbed his sidearm from the workbench, instincts sharpened from decades of combat kicking in. The air around him shimmered, and a low, resonant hum filled the bay. A pale, swirling light materialized near the docking corridor. Elias raised his weapon, finger steady on the trigger. With a crackling surge, the light coalesced into a humanoid figure. A woman tall and striking, clad in sleek, metallic armor that glinted like molten steel. Her skin was a soft, luminescent silver, faint patterns of glowing lines tracing delicate paths along her arms and neck. Her face was sharp yet impossibly graceful, framed by flowing white hair that seemed to ripple like starlight. Piercing violet eyes locked onto his, cold and unreadable. "Lower your weapon," she commanded, her voice rich with authority, tempered by something far more dangerous: urgency. Elias kept his aim steady. "Identify yourself. I am Salif, High Envoy of the New York Theory Dominion." Her tone softened slightly, though steel remained beneath it. "We have no time for human bravado. You are coming with me." His jaw tightened. "Like hell I am." Before he could react, she surged forward with impossible speed, disarming him in a fluid, practiced motion. His sidearm skidded across the floor as she pressed him against the cold bulkhead. Her hand locked firmly around his wrist. Despite her lithe frame, her grip was unyielding, as though iron and flesh were one. Elias struggled, but Salith's strength was inhuman. He felt the press of her body against his, her warmth radiating through the thin barrier of his shirt. For a brief, breathless moment, their eyes met, hers fierce but conflicted. He caught the faintest quiver of something almost human in her expression, though it vanished just as quickly. "We can do this the hard way," she hissed, her breath warm against his ear. "Or you can come willingly." "Why?" he demanded, breathing heavily. "Why me?" Salith's eyes flickered with something akin to regret. "Because you are compatible." Before he could respond, his world dissolved into searing white light. A surge of energy crackled through his nerves, overwhelming every sense at once. He gasped as alien symbols etched themselves into his mind, fragments of something ancient and unfathomable. In that blinding instant, he felt her. Not just her touch, but her presence, intense and unyielding, a force that burned through his very being. When the light faded, Elias collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Salith stood over him, her expression unreadable, though her breathing was just as uneven. "You've been chosen," she whispered, almost reluctantly, "and there is no escape." Elias awoke to the cold sensation of metal beneath his hands, his head throbbing with the aftershock of whatever alien force had overwhelmed him. He groaned and tried to move, but his wrists were bound by shimmering energy cuffs that pulsed faintly with a soft, rhythmic hum. The air was sharp and sterile, tinged with an otherworldly scent, metallic, yet strangely floral. He forced himself to his knees, his eyes adjusting to the dim, shifting lights of the alien chamber. Curved walls gleamed like liquid silver, etched with intricate, glowing symbols. The architecture felt alive, breathing with some unseen pulse. There were no visible doors, no windows, just endless metallic surfaces that seemed to stretch into infinity. A quiet hiss echoed behind him. Elias twisted sharply, his muscles coiling in readiness. From the shadows emerged Salif, clad now in a more regal version of her armor, dark silver woven with faintly glowing threads of violet. Her long white hair cascaded like silk over her shoulders, giving her an almost ethereal majesty. She held herself with rigid authority, though her expression was harder to read now. Cool, reserved, yet charged with something far deeper beneath the surface. "You're awake," she said, her voice calm but edged with something sharper, expectation perhaps. She stepped closer, and he noticed for the first time how her armor seemed almost fluid, shifting subtly with her movements like a second skin. Elias scowled. "If this is how you treat your guests, I'm not impressed." "You are not a guest," Salith replied smoothly, her gaze never wavering. "You are a necessity." He strained against the cuffs, feeling the alien restraints tighten in response. "Then let me guess, you abduct humans, chain them up and—" "What?" "Use them as breeders." His voice dripped with disgust. Salith's expression flickered for the briefest moment, a flash of something unreadable in her striking violet eyes. "You misunderstand," she said, her voice quieter now. "This is not about conquest. It is survival." She reached out, and with a slow, deliberate motion, waved her hand over the cuffs. They dissolved into shimmering particles, leaving a lingering warmth on his wrists. He stared at her warily but didn't move. "Our species is dying," Salith continued. "New York theory are on the brink of extinction. Generations of genetic collapse have made it impossible for us to reproduce without outside help." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "Humans are uniquely compatible." Elias snorted bitterly. "Convenient." Her eyes narrowed, irritation flashing across her face. "Do not mistake necessity for convenience." She stepped closer, her presence commanding yet strangely intimate. "We are not monsters, Captain. Every action we take is driven by the need to survive, nothing more." He held her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "And me? Was I just some unlucky draw?" "You were chosen," she said, voice steady. "Not by chance, but by design." Elias clenched his jaw. "I didn't agree to anything." Salith stepped even closer, her expression softening, though her intensity never wavered. "We had no time to ask," she admitted quietly. "You were the only viable candidate within range. Without you, my people have no future." Her honesty disarmed him, though he hated himself for it. For the first time, he saw something beyond the cold, calculating envoy she projected, something far more vulnerable. Desperation, resolve, loneliness. The tension between them thickened, charged with unspoken understanding. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing lightly against his wrist. Not as a captor, but as if testing his reaction. Her touch was warm, almost searing, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine. "Release me," Elias demanded, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "I cannot." Her voice dropped to a near whisper, her fingers lingering just a moment too long before retreating. "You are bound, as I am." For a fleeting instant, they stood locked in place, neither willing to yield. Her violet eyes gleamed with something far deeper than duty, something Elias couldn't quite name but felt all the same. Before he could respond, a sharp, mechanical chime echoed through the chamber. Salith's gaze snapped toward the glowing symbols etched into the wall, now flickering with warning light. "They've found us," she hissed, her entire demeanor shifting into combat readiness. "Who?" Elias demanded. "Rebel factions," she said curtly. striding toward a nearby console that materialized from the wall. Not all New York theory agree with our approach. A low, resonant hum reverberated through the ship, growing steadily louder. The air crackled with electric tension. Elias stepped forward. What do they want? Salith's jaw clenched. You. Before either could say more, the wall behind them exploded in a shower of molten metal and searing light. Elias barely had time to shield his face before armed New York theory soldiers surged into the room, their weapons gleaming with deadly purpose. Salith turned toward him, her expression fierce, she commanded, drawing twin, curved blades from the shimmering fabric of her armor. This fight is far from over. The air pulsed with electric tension as the invading New York theory soldiers poured into the chamber, their gleaming armor crackling with energy shields. Elias's instincts roared to life. He dove behind a shattered console as weapons fire scorched the metallic walls around him, leaving molten scars in their wake. Salith moved like liquid fire, her twin blades humming with an eerie violet glow. In one fluid motion, she surged forward, meeting the attackers head-on. Her strikes were precise, lethal, each slash a dance of deadly grace. Sparks erupted with every collision of blade and armor, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Elias watched in grim awe, his mind snapping back to the countless battles he'd survived in his former life. He spotted a fallen soldier's weapon and lunged for it, his fingers closing around its alien grip just as a blast scorched the floor inches from his side. He spun, instinctively squeezing the trigger. A burst of searing light struck an advancing soldier square in the chest, sending the enemy crashing into the wall. Another charged at him, raising a wickedly curved weapon. But before the blow could land, Salith intersected with a brutal upward slash, sending the attacker sprawling. "Stay down," she commanded, breathless but unyielding. Elias bristled. Not a chance. With a sharp nod of understanding, she pivoted, covering him as they fought side by side. Despite their different combat styles, his raw, pragmatic, hers fluid and precise, they moved in sync, an unspoken rhythm forming between them. The battle surged to a brutal crescendo until the last of the attackers fell, their bodies scattered across the scorched chamber floor. A sharp silence followed, broken only by the hum of damaged circuitry and the harsh rhythm of Elias's breathing. Salith wiped a streak of shimmering blood from her cheek, her features tense but composed. "We have to move," she said curtly, already scanning the room for an exit. Elias rose, his grip tightening on the alien weapon. "Who the hell were they?" "New York theory extremists," she answered, her tone clipped. "They believe humans should be harvested by force if necessary. To them, you're property." Her voice faltered on the last word, a flicker of guilt passing through her eyes. Elias met her gaze steadily. "And you're different?" Her expression hardened, though a trace of vulnerability lingered beneath her fierce exterior. "I chose another way," she said quietly. "But not all of my people agree." Before he could press further, a distant explosion rumbled through the ship, shaking the floor beneath them. Salith cursed in her native tongue, a sharp, melodic sound that made the hair on Elias's neck stand on end. "They're breaching the central core," she said, already moving toward a side corridor that shimmered into existence as she approached. "If they take control, this entire vessel will collapse." Elias hesitated only a second before following her into the narrow, pulsating hallway. He had no reason to trust her. Every instinct screamed that she was still keeping too much from him, but survival came first. And right now, sticking with Salith was his best shot. They navigated the labyrinthine passages in tense silence, the distant sounds of combat echoing through the ship like a drumbeat. Elias kept pace easily, his combat training kicking in despite the alien surroundings. Finally, they reached a reinforced door etched with glowing runes. Salith placed her hand against the panel, her fingers tracing the intricate symbols. Light surged beneath her touch, and the door slid open with a resonant hum. The room beyond was unlike anything Elias had seen. It pulsed with soft, radiant light, its walls shifting like living metal. At its center stood a raised platform surrounded by gently swirling energy fields. Strange, crystalline structures floated above, casting shimmering reflections across the chamber. "What is this place?" he asked, eyes narrowing. Salith hesitated, her fingers brushing against one of the crystalline structures. "The heart of the vessel," she answered softly. "It sustains the ship and connects its inhabitants." Her voice held a note of reverence, almost longing. For a fleeting moment, she seemed human, her guarded mask slipping just enough for Elias to glimpse something deeper. Loneliness, perhaps, or something more profound. Before he could speak, alarms blared again, sharper this time, urgent and final. "They're overriding the command systems," Salith said, her tone sharp once more. "We have minutes at best." Elias stepped closer. "What do we do?" She met his gaze, her violet eyes blazing with determination. "We link." His brow furrowed. "Link our minds," she explained quickly. "The ship responds to bonded pairs, but only if the connection is strong enough." Her voice dropped, suddenly uncertain. "It's dangerous, but it's the only way." He stared at her, realization dawning. That's what this was all about. Not just survival. You needed someone compatible to control the ship. Her expression faltered, and for the first time, she looked almost afraid. "I needed you." The raw vulnerability in her voice struck deeper than any weapon could have. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging thick in the air. Finally, Elias exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening with grim resolve. "What do I have to do?" Salith stepped closer, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed his wrist. Not with command, but with quiet pleading. "Trust me." Their eyes locked, and in that charged instant, Elias reached up, cradling her face gently yet firmly. Her breath hitched at the unexpected contact, her walls crumbling just enough for her to lean into his touch. "Let's do this," he said, voice low but steady. Salith nodded, her expression fierce and unyielding once more. But in her gaze burned something far deeper than desperation. Hope. The chamber pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, its shimmering walls radiating a soft light that seemed to pulse in sync with Salith's heartbeat. Or perhaps Elias's. The alien energy field surrounding the platform hummed with potential, vibrating faintly in the charged atmosphere. He could feel the pressure building, pressing against his senses like a rising tide. Salith stepped onto the raised platform, her tall, elegant frame illuminated by the swirling energy. For a moment, she looked almost otherworldly, part warrior, part goddess. But there was a vulnerability in her eyes that anchored her firmly in reality. This wasn't just a mission for her. It was survival, layered with something far more personal. Elias followed cautiously, his mind racing with questions he couldn't afford to ask. The air between them was thick with tension, unspoken, electric. He could still feel the ghost of her touch from moments before, warm and deliberate, lingering in a way that felt far too intimate for necessity. "What happens when we link?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Salith met his gaze, her expression carefully controlled. "Our minds will connect through the vessel's neural interface. Thoughts, emotions, memories. They will flow freely between us." Her tone softened slightly. "The stronger the bond, the more control we'll have." He frowned. "What if it doesn't work?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then the extremists take the ship, and everything we've fought for ends." The unspoken weight of her words settled heavily between them. Failure wasn't an option. Not for her people, not for her. And now, not for him. Elias drew a slow, measured breath, stepping fully onto the platform. "All right, let's get this over with." Salith's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by his resolve. She extended her hand, palm up, fingers trembling just enough for him to notice. He hesitated only a second before placing his hand in hers, their fingers intertwining. A soft pulse of energy rippled through the chamber at their touch, sending a warm, tingling sensation up Elias's arm. His breath hitched, the sensation equal parts comforting and disorienting. "Close your eyes," Salith instructed, her voice low and steady, though he could hear the faint tremor beneath her calm facade. He obeyed, letting his breathing slow. Her fingers tightened around his as she guided his free hand to rest against her chest, just above the faintly glowing lines tracing her skin. Her pulse thrummed beneath his fingertips, steady but fierce, like the rhythm of a distant star. The air grew warmer, charged with potential energy. His mind buzzed with anticipation, the edges of his consciousness prickling with unfamiliar sensation. He felt her presence pressing gently against his mind. Not invasive, but insistent,
"Let me in,"
like a tide
she whispered,
beckoning the shore, her voice brushing against his thoughts like a warm breeze. Elias resisted instinctively, years of military conditioning screaming at him to maintain control. But then she leaned in, her forehead resting gently against his, and the closeness shattered his defenses. "I need you," she breathed, her voice raw with honesty. "Not just for the mission. You." The walls he built around himself cracked, and in that vulnerable instant, he let go. Their minds collided with searing intensity. A kaleidoscope of emotions surged through him. Grief, hope, loneliness, determination. All tangled with memories that weren't his own. He saw flashes of Salith's past, standing alone on a war-torn battlefield, issuing commands with icy precision while suppressing the crushing weight of loss. He felt her desperation, her fear of failure tempered by an unyielding will to survive. Through the haze of shared memories, he sensed her feeling his life. Years of war, loss, and regret carved into his soul like old battle scars. He felt her recoil at his darkest memories, but she didn't withdraw. Instead, she held on tighter, anchoring them both. The intensity was overwhelming, threatening to consume them. But then, amid the chaos, came something far gentler. He felt her presence wrap around him like warmth after a bitter cold. Not demanding, but accepting. And then, stillness. When Elias opened his eyes, the chamber was bathed in radiant light. The swirling energy fields had stabilized, their once chaotic pulses now synchronized, steady and controlled. Salith still held him, her breathing uneven, her gaze shimmering with unshed tears. For a long, silent moment, they stood there, connected in ways that defied explanation. "You did it?" she whispered, almost disbelieving. "We did it," Elias thought, though the words felt too small for what had just happened. Before either of them could speak, the chamber's alarm blared, shattering the fragile stillness. An urgent message flashed across the crystalline displays. Enemy forces breaching the ship's central core. Salith's expression hardened instantly, the warrior mask sliding back into place. But her hand remained tightly clasped in his, unwilling or unable to let go. "We're not done yet," Elias said grimly, already reaching for the weapon he'd taken from one of the fallen soldiers. Salith nodded, her gaze fierce but lit with something new, hope tempered by fierce determination. "No," she agreed, her voice steady. "We fight together." The echoes of the blaring alarms chased them through the shimmering metallic corridors as Elias and Salith sprinted side by side. The ship pulsed with renewed life, responding instinctively to the bond they had forged in the heart of the vessel. Every glowing panel and shifting wall adjusted to their movements, guiding them toward the central core where the invading extremists were forcing their final breach. Elias gripped the alien weapon tightly, his senses heightened from the lingering energy of the bond. He could still feel Salith's presence brushing against the edge of his mind, a steady, grounding warmth that thrummed in time with the pulse of the ship itself. It was strange, intimate in a way he couldn't fully explain, yet strangely reassuring. Salith moved with fierce purpose, her twin blades shimmering with deadly light as they twisted through the dim corridors. Her face was a mask of focus, but Elias could feel the storm of emotions simmering beneath her calm exterior. Determination, fear, and something deeper she hadn't yet put into words. As they approached the final corridor leading to the central core, Salith slowed, raising her hand in a silent signal. Elias nodded, falling into a practice combat stance he hadn't used in years. Old instincts returned with ruthless clarity. The air grew thick with static energy, the sound of heavy boots echoing just beyond the next junction. Salith glanced back at him, her violet eyes blazing with intensity. "No hesitation," she whispered. "They'll kill us both if they break through." "I'm not planning on dying today," Elias replied, his voice steady. Before he could second-guess himself, Salith surged forward, a blur of lethal grace. Elias followed without hesitation, weapon raised. They struck hard and fast. The corridor erupted into chaos as Nearctheri extremists turned to face the sudden assault. Salith was on them instantly, her blades carving through the front line with brutal precision. Elias provided covering fire, each shot landing with deadly accuracy as he advanced alongside her. The battle was fierce, relentless. Sparks and molten debris showered the floor as weapons clashed and energy blasts seared the walls. Despite the overwhelming odds, Elias and Salith fought as one. Their movements synchronized in perfect, unspoken harmony. At one point, a towering Nearctheri warrior lunged at Elias with a massive blade crackling with violet energy. He barely managed to block the blow, his knees buckling under the sheer force. Before the warrior could strike again, Salith appeared behind the attacker, her blade slicing cleanly through the alien's armor in a single, fluid motion. Their eyes met briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. No words were needed. The battle raged on until the last enemy fell with a heavy thud, leaving the corridor littered with fallen bodies and scorched metal. Elias wiped a streak of sweat from his brow, his breathing ragged but steady. Salith sheathed her blades with practiced precision, her gaze already scanning the nearby control panels flashing with urgent warnings. "We don't have long," she said grimly. "They've set the core to overload." "How bad?" Elias asked, moving to check the displays. "Total collapse in less than 10 minutes, she replied. "If the core detonates, the entire vessel and everything within range will be destroyed." Elias's jaw tightened. "How do we shut it down?" Salith hesitated, her expression darkening. "We can't." The weight of her words sank in like a lead anchor. "Then what the hell are we still doing here?" "There's a manual override," she admitted, her voice low. "But it can only be activated from inside the core chamber." Her gaze dropped for a fraction of a second. "The process, it's fatal." Elias stared at her, realization dawning with chilling clarity. "You are going to do this alone." Her shoulders squared, defiant despite the raw emotion flashing in her eyes. "It's my responsibility." "The hell it is," Elias snapped, stepping in close. "We've come this far. There has to be another way." "There isn't." Her voice broke slightly, though she quickly masked it with fierce resolve. "This is what I was trained for. It's my duty." His chest tightened at the thought of losing her, not just because of the mission, but because of her. Salith, the warrior who had fought beside him without question, the woman who had let him see her strength and her vulnerability. "Then we do it together," he said firmly. "No more running, no more sacrifices." Salith's breath caught, her composure wavering for the first time. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his wrist, light, tentative, as if she feared the contact might shatter what little resolve she had left. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If we link again inside the core, it could kill us both." Elias cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the delicate, glowing lines along her cheek. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, grounding him in the storm of chaos surrounding them. "Then we take the chance," he said softly, his voice steady and resolute. "Together." For a long, breathless moment, Salith searched his face, her fierce, guarded walls crumbling in the wake of his quiet determination. Slowly, she leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his as their shared connection flared, strong and undeniable. Their breathing steadied, synchronizing with the hum of the vessel's pulse. "Together," she whispered. Without another word, they turned toward the glowing door leading to the central core, stepping into the unknown side by side. The core chamber loomed ahead like the beating heart of some vast, living entity. Pulsing arcs of energy surged along the towering crystalline spires that stretched from floor to ceiling, casting flickering shadows across the gleaming metallic walls. The air was charged with a palpable heat, the raw intensity of the core's unstable power pressing against their skin like a living force. Elias's gaze swept the massive, circular chamber, locking onto the central control pedestal, suspended above a glowing energy field. Its surface shimmered with alien runes, flickering in an urgent rhythm that matched the pounding alarms echoing through the ship. He could feel the countdown ticking toward destruction, seconds slipping away like grains of sand through clenched fingers. Salith moved ahead, her expression sharp and focused, though Elias could sense the tension radiating from her. Every step she took seemed deliberate, weighed down by the inevitability of what lay ahead. He followed without hesitation, weapon ready, scanning the dim, shifting shadows for any sign of lingering attack. Salith extended her hand, activating the holographic console with a practiced swipe. Streams of data cascaded down the translucent screen, alien symbols rearranging themselves in rapid, shifting patterns. "It's worse than I thought," she murmured, her voice tight with frustration. "The extremists overloaded the core's containment field. It's already collapsing." Elias stepped closer, his fingers brushing against her arm in a grounding touch. "Can you stop it?" She hesitated, her shoulders tensing. "If I stabilize the core manually, I can redirect the overload. But the feedback will." "Stop," Elias interrupted firmly. "You're not finishing that sentence." Her gaze snapped to his, defiant yet conflicted. "There is no other way. There's always another way." He tightened his grip on her arm, grounding her. "We didn't come this far just to throw it all away." The ship groaned around them, sending a cascade of molten sparks raining down from the ceiling. Salith exhaled sharply, her fists clenching as she fought to maintain control, not just of the situation, but of herself. "The core's energy will tear through any direct link," she said, her voice cracking just enough for him to hear the strain. "Even if we try, there's no guarantee we'll survive the connection." Elias studied her, seeing past the hardened warrior's mask to the woman beneath. Driven, unyielding, terrified of losing more than just her life. He placed his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me," he said quietly, intensity burning behind his steel blue eyes. "You're not doing this alone. Whatever happens, we face it together." Her breath hitched, and for a fleeting moment, she let herself lean into his touch, drawing strength from the warmth of his hands. The bond between them flared softly, a fragile but unwavering thread connecting their minds. It steadied her, dissolving the cold fear coiled tight in her chest. With renewed resolve, she reached up and cupped his face, her fingers tracing the rough lines of his jaw. "You're a stubborn, reckless fool," she whispered, something dangerously close to affection shining in her violet eyes. "I should have left you behind." He smirked faintly, though the emotion in his gaze ran far deeper. "But you didn't." Before she could respond, a violent tremor rocked the chamber, sending fractures splintering across the floor. The core flared with a blinding surge of energy, burning brighter with each unstable pulse. Time was running out. Without another word, they moved in perfect sync, stepping into the activation ring at the center of the platform. The crystalline spires resonated with an otherworldly hum, responding to the intensity of their shared presence. The air thrummed with rising energy, crackling in fierce, unpredictable arcs. Salith took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening around his. "When the link stabilizes, don't resist." Elias nodded, his grip unwavering. "I trust you." She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes as she pressed her free hand against the activation console. Light erupted from the core, engulfing them in a cascade of searing white brilliance. Their entwined hands became the bridge between mortal and machine, mind and heart. The link snapped into place with crushing intensity. A tidal wave of sensation surged through them, raw and unfiltered. A collision of thoughts, emotions, and memories merging into one. For an agonizing moment, Elias felt as though he were falling into infinity, lost in a sea of blinding energy. Then he felt her, not as a distant presence, but as a vivid, living force burning with fierce determination. Her memories surged through him like molten fire. Years of relentless battles, crushing losses, and a lifetime spent fighting a war she could never win. Through the storm of shared memories, he anchored himself to her, pouring his own strength into the bond. He showed her his past, endless battles, shattered loyalties, and a future he'd thought lost, until their shared connection ignited into something far greater than survival. A fierce, undeniable force that defied fear, pain, and death itself. Together they pushed, the core's raging power strained against them, fighting to consume everything in its path. Energy surged through their linked minds, threatening to tear them apart, but they held on, together. Through sheer force of will, they redirected the core's unstable energy into the containment field. The blazing light dimmed, stabilizing in a steady, pulsing rhythm that matched the beat of their joined hearts. Finally, the energy field dissipated with a deep, resonant hum. Breathing heavily, Elias and Salith collapsed to their knees, still clutching each other as the last echoes of power faded into stillness. The chamber's burning intensity softened into a dim, tranquil glow. Salith's fingers lingered against his face, tracing the rough edges of his features as if to reassure herself he was real. He rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet aftermath. "It worked," she whispered, voice raw with disbelief and relief. Elias managed a faint, exhausted smile. "Told you. We don't go down that easy." A quiet, trembling laugh escaped her, unguarded and genuine. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, connected, alive, and together. The stillness that followed felt surreal, almost fragile after the chaos they had endured. The core chamber, now dim and quiet, pulsed gently with restored energy, its deadly instability replaced by a serene rhythm that resonated faintly beneath the metallic floor. Elias sat back on his heels, his breath still ragged from the exertion of stabilizing the core. His head swam with the lingering echoes of the link, fragments of memories and emotions that weren't entirely his but felt etched into his soul nonetheless. He could still feel the burning intensity of Salith's presence intertwined with his own, fierce and unyielding. Salith remained close, her fingers resting against his chest as if ensuring he was still there, still alive. Her violet eyes shimmered faintly, reflecting the softened glow of the chamber's crystalline spires. There was something raw and unspoken in her gaze. Gratitude, relief, and something far deeper she couldn't seem to put into words. Before either of them could speak, the ship's intercom crackled sharply, cutting through the calm with an ominous urgency. Intruders detected on command level. Hostile forces breaching Central Bridge. The announcement shattered the fleeting moment of peace like breaking glass. Elias pushed himself to his feet, helping Salith up with a firm, steady grip. Her expression hardened instantly, the warrior in her snapping back into focus. "They're making a final push," she said grimly. "They'll try to seize control now that the core's stabilized." Elias checked the charge on his alien weapon, his grip tightening instinctively. "Then we stop them." She hesitated for a heartbeat, her gaze lingering on him. "You should escape while you can. The ship will obey your commands now. You don't have to stay." He met her gaze fiercely. "We both know I'm not leaving." Her breath hitched just slightly, but she nodded, accepting his resolve without protest. Together, they turned toward the exit, falling into step like they'd been fighting side by side for years. As they raced through the winding corridors toward the ship's central bridge, Elias couldn't shake the lingering intensity of the link they'd shared. He could still feel the warmth of Salith's hand in his, even though they weren't touching now. The connection burned faintly at the edge of his mind, not invasive but ever-present, like a promise unspoken yet deeply understood. The corridor widened into a massive, open expanse lined with towering support pillars and shifting energy fields. The central bridge lay just ahead, blocked by an imposing blast door reinforced with thick, glowing barriers. Before they could reach it, a group of heavily armed New York Theory extremists emerged from the far side of the chamber, their weapons already raised. Leading them was a towering figure clad in dark, segmented armor etched with crimson runes. A brutal warlord Elias recognized from Salith's fragmented memories during the link. "Commander Nyrex," Salith hissed, her voice low and venomous. Nyrex's sharp, predatory gaze locked onto them, his expression twisting into a cruel, triumphant smirk. "You should have stayed dead, Salith," he sneered, his voice a deep, resonant growl. "But I'm glad you didn't. Killing you will make this victory so much sweeter." Without another word, he raised one clawed hand, and his soldiers surged forward with deadly precision. Elias and Salith moved as one. The chamber exploded into chaos as blasts of searing energy lit up the darkened expanse. Elias took cover behind a fallen support beam, firing calculated, precise shots that took down several attackers with ruthless efficiency. Salith charged directly into the fray, her twin blades slicing through armored foes like liquid fire, every movement swift and lethal. The battle raged with brutal intensity. Sparks and molten debris scattered across the chamber as enemies fell one by one, though more surged in to take their place. Elias covered Salith's back, his weapon burning hot. Nyrex closed the distance with terrifying speed, a brutal war axe crackling with destructive energy gripped tightly in both hands. Salith barely managed to block his first swing, her blades locking against his with a violent, echoing clash. "You're weak, Salith," Nyrex snarled, forcing her back with a savage shove. "Clinging to human filth won't save you." Salith gritted her teeth, twisting free and delivering a sharp, precise strike that cracked his armor but failed to break through. "I don't need saving," she spat, fierce and unyielding. Elias rushed to her side, firing a devastating blast that caught Nyrex off guard, forcing him back. The warlord snarled, his expression darkening with rage as he prepared for another brutal assault. Before he could strike again, the floor beneath them rumbled violently. The ship's core, still stabilizing, surged with renewed energy, causing the chamber's crystalline spires to flare with brilliant light. Nyrex faltered for half a second, glancing toward the glowing walls, and Elias seized the opening. He launched himself forward with brutal precision, driving his shoulder into Nyrex's chest and sending the warlord staggering back. Salith followed up instantly, delivering a devastating slash that shattered his weapon's energy field with a blinding flash. Breathing heavily, Elias raised his weapon for a killing blow, but before he could fire, Nyrex snarled a guttural command into his communicator. A blast of harsh energy erupted from his armor, forcing Elias and Salith back. "We're not finished," Nyrex growled, his gaze burning with hate. "I will see you both broken." With that, he vanished into the blinding flash of an emergency teleport field, leaving the shattered remnants of his soldiers scattered across the ruined chamber. The sudden stillness felt deafening after the fierce intensity of the fight. Elias steadied himself, breathing hard, his weapon still raised instinctively. Salith lowered her blades slowly, her gaze fixed on where Nyrex had vanished. Her jaw clenched, though her hands trembled faintly from exertion and something deeper. "He'll be back," she said quietly. Elias lowered his weapon, stepping closer. "So will we." Their eyes met, and for the first time since the battle began, Salith allowed herself to exhale, relieved, exhausted, and no longer alone. The aftermath of the battle weighed heavily on the silent corridors of the ship as Elias and Salith made their way toward the command deck. The distant hum of the vessel's restored core echoed faintly beneath their boots, but the air was still thick with tension. Though Nyrex and his soldiers had retreated, the fight was far from over. Elias adjusted his grip on the alien weapon, its barrel still warm from the brutal firefight. His body ached from exertion, but the adrenaline surging through his veins kept him sharp. He cast a sidelong glance at Salith, noting the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her fingers lingered on the hilts of her twin blades. Ready for another fight? You holding up? He asked, keeping his tone steady but concerned. I'm fine, she replied curtly, her gaze locked forward. He recognized the deflective edge in her voice. It was the same tone he'd used 100 times after facing near certain death. She was trying to stay in control, keep her focus on the mission, but her tension radiated through the fate bond still pulsing at the edge of his mind. Salith, he softened his voice. We'll finish this. Together. She hesitated, her steps slowing just enough for him to catch up. He won't stop, she said quietly, her voice brittle. Nyrex doesn't know how. He's obsessed with power, with control, with breaking me. Elias's jaw tightened. He failed before. He'll fail again. Her gaze flicked toward him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but she found none. His steady presence grounded her, cutting through the crushing weight of responsibility she'd carried alone for so long. Before she could respond, a deep, resonant chime reverberated through the ship, signaling an incoming transmission. The walls pulsed faintly, and a holographic console materialized in the center of the corridor, shimmering with distorted static. Salith stepped forward and activated the display with a sharp gesture. A flickering image resolved into the menacing form of Nyrex. His expression twisted into a cruel, triumphant sneer. Salith, he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. Still alive, and still running. How predictable. Her fingers twitched toward her blades, but she forced herself to remain still. Whatever game you're playing, it's over, she said coldly. The ship is stabilized. You've lost. Nyrex chuckled darkly. You think this was about the ship? He leaned closer, his burning crimson eyes locking onto hers with malicious intensity. This was always about you. Elias shifted protectively beside her, his weapon ready, though he sensed the transmission wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. Nyrex continued, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper. I've taken the outer colonies. Your people are scattered, leaderless, desperate. When I'm done with you, they'll beg to kneel at my feet. Salith's breathing hitched, though she kept her expression icy and unreadable. You'll fail. The warlord's grin widened, predatory and confident. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Before she could respond, the transmission cut off, leaving only the faint hum of the corridor's power relays. Salith clenched her fists, her body trembling with barely contained rage. Elias reached out, resting his hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her. He's trying to break you, Elias said quietly. Don't let him. Her eyes met his, still blazing with anger. But beneath the fury lay something far more vulnerable. Fear, not for herself, but for her people. And for him. I can't let him win, she whispered, her voice cracking. If he takes this ship, everything we fought for will mean nothing. Elias stepped closer, his grip on her shoulder tightening. Not with restraint, but reassurance. Then we don't let him. For a moment, Salith let herself lean into his touch, drawing strength from his quiet, unwavering presence. Their bond flared softly in response, binding them in a way words never could. We end this, she said firmly, her voice steady once more. Together, they moved toward the final stretch of the command deck, every step charged with purpose. The air grew colder, more oppressive, as they neared the heavily reinforced doors leading to the ship's command center. Dark, twisted symbols etched into the walls pulsed faintly with crimson light, marks left behind by Nyrex's twisted influence. Elias studied the corrupted symbols with a grim frown. What is this? Nyrex is doing, Salith replied, her voice tight. He's using forbidden tech, ancient war codes meant to override the ship's neural core. Can you stop it? He asked. Not from here, she admitted. We'll have to face him directly. Elias nodded, accepting the inevitability without hesitation. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The massive command doors groaned as Salith activated the final override, splitting apart with a deafening metallic shriek. Beyond them lay the darkened expanse of the command bridge, its central dais bathed in a sinister, blood-red glow. And standing at its heart, surrounded by crackling arcs of dark energy, was Nyrex, waiting, ready. "Welcome," he sneered, spreading his arms mockingly. "I've been expecting you." The command bridge loomed before them like the maw of a beast, dark and seething with malevolent energy. The walls pulsed with crimson veins of corrupted power, twisting the once pristine surfaces into something unrecognizable. The air was thick with static, crackling with the oppressive force radiating from the command dais where Nyrex stood, shrouded in a sinister aura. Elias and Salith advanced cautiously, weapons raised, every sense heightened. The tension between them thrummed like a live wire, charged with the certainty that this would be their final confrontation. There would be no retreat, no second chances. Nyrex watched them with a twisted smirk, his crimson eyes gleaming with dark amusement. His armored form radiated raw, unstable power, the dark runes etched into his body flaring with chaotic energy. "You've come far," Nyrex drawled, spreading his arms theatrically. "But you're too late. The ship belongs to me now." Salith stepped forward, her voice cold and unyielding. "You'll never control this vessel, not while I live." Nyrex's smirk widened, cruel and predatory. "That can be arranged." With a guttural snarl, he thrust his clawed hand toward the corrupted control terminal, sending a surge of dark energy hurtling toward them. Elias reacted instantly, dragging Salith to cover as the blast shattered the floor where they'd stood moments before. Molten debris scattering across Salith was already moving, a blur of lethal precision. Her twin blades ignited with brilliant violet light as she charged, her every motion fueled by relentless determination. Nyrex met her strike with brutal efficiency, his massive war axe clashing against her blades in a shower of sparks. Their weapons locked, grinding against one another with searing intensity as raw energy surged between them. Elias emerged from cover, weapon raised, firing precise bursts of searing light that forced Nyrex to break the lock and retreat several paces. His shots struck true, but the warlord's corrupted armor absorbed much of the damage, glowing brighter with each hit. Snarling, Nyrex unleashed another wave of dark energy, forcing Elias and Salith apart. The floor buckled beneath them, throwing Elias against a shattered console with bone-jarring force. He gasped in pain but forced himself back to his feet, unwilling to stay down. Nyrex turned his attention fully to Salith, his war axe crackling with deadly intent. "Did you really think he could save you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Humans are weak, temporary. You'll watch him die, just like the others." Salith's expression twisted with fury, her blades flashing in a relentless series of strikes that drove Nyrex back step by step. Every movement was fueled by raw emotion, rage, defiance, and something far more personal. She refused to let Nyrex's twisted words sink into her mind. Elias circled wide, seeking another angle, his mind working furiously. Nyrex was strong, impossibly so, but his power was unstable, fueled by the corrupted systems still linked to the ship's neural core. And then it hit him. "Salith!" he shouted, firing a series of precise shots that struck the corrupted pylons surrounding the dais. Sparks erupted from the damaged conduits, sending violent tremors through the bridge. "The pylons," Elias continued, his voice sharp with urgency. "They're feeding his power. Take them out." Understanding dawned in her eyes. Without missing a beat, she pivoted mid-strike, her blade slicing through one of the crackling pylons in a single fluid motion. Energy exploded outward in a blinding arc, destabilizing Nyrex's aura just enough for Elias to land a direct shot on the warlord's exposed side. Nyrex howled in rage, stumbling back, his armor flickering dangerously. "You will pay," he snarled, lunging toward Elias with murderous intent. Elias rolled aside, narrowly avoiding the crushing swing of Nyrex's war axe. He retaliated with another precise blast, striking the warlord's weakened armor and forcing him back toward the corrupted control terminal. Now, Elias shouted, locking eyes with Salith. She surged forward, her blades flashing with renewed intensity as she struck the final pylon. The entire bridge shuddered violently as the corrupted network collapsed in a storm of rupturing energy conduits. Nyrex staggered, his armor sparking and flickering as the dark power sustaining him faltered. His twisted expression twisted into something almost desperate. "You can't win," he roared, forcing himself upright through sheer will. Elias didn't hesitate. He charged forward, slamming his shoulder into Nyrex's weakened form and driving him back against the corrupted terminal. Sparks erupted in a blinding cascade as unstable energy surged through Nyrex's armor, locking him in place. Salith was there in an instant, her blades crossed at Nyrex's throat. Her breathing was ragged, her violet eyes blazing with unyielding resolve. "It's over," she hissed. For a moment, Nyrex struggled, still clinging to his shattered ambitions. But the power sustaining him was gone, consumed by the ship's restored systems. His gaze flickered with twisted hatred, and, finally, acceptance. With one last snarl, the corrupted energy erupted in a violent, final pulse, consuming him in a storm of crackling light. When the surge faded, Nyrex was gone, erased, his twisted legacy reduced to scattered, lifeless ash. Breathing heavily, Elias and Salith stood in the aftermath, the silence of the shattered command bridge stretching around them like the calm after a violent storm. Slowly, Salith lowered her blades, her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. Elias reached out, resting a steadying hand on her arm, grounding her once again. "It's over," he murmured, his voice low and steady. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she turned, her expression softening as her gaze met his. "We survived," she whispered, almost disbelieving. He managed a faint, weary smile. Together, the ship's soft, rhythmic hum resonated through the chamber, its systems stabilizing at last. The dark corruption was gone, replaced by a faint, tranquil light that pulsed gently, alive and whole. And for the first time in what felt like forever, so were they.